Which plugins do I actually use as a mixing and mastering engineer when I work on client projects? I get this question a lot, so in this video right here, I'm going to reveal the 10 plugins I use in almost every session right now, why I believe that these plugins are more effective than other tools, and also how to use them in a typical mixing and mastering session for electronic music. But first, here's a word of warning. Don't go on a plugin buying spree after watching this video. It just doesn't make sense, and you will get 90% of the benefits from the stock tools in your DAW. Especially if you're just starting out with producing and mixing electronic music, you will just get overwhelmed. So my only goal with this video is to transparently show what I'm actually using as a mixing and mastering engineer, and to also reveal my thought process behind these choices. So the first plugin on my list is a surgical EQ called the Kof EQ. It actually replaced FabFilter Pro Q3, and I'm going to share with you why. So I'm using this now on a drum tops bus. Let me just quickly play this for you. And on a first look, it's really similar to the FabFilter Pro Q3. So when I first saw this EQ, I actually thought that this was just like a FabFilter ripoff. But it does a few things beyond that, which I personally like quite a lot. It's relatively similar. You have this frequency layout. And you can also right-click, which then lets you select specific frequencies that you maybe want to notch out. And this is just so much more handy than the way FabFilter does it. So I can just grab it here, notch it out. Not that I need to do this here, but this is a nice way to get rid of resonances. Just like with the FabFilter, you can solo bands. But the thing that I like the most is that you get to choose different filter styles and curves that are somehow also coming from the analog world. They don't model the saturation characteristics of these units. But for example, when I pull something in from the right side here, I've adjusted this to be a specific shape of the 250 Sontec, I think it is. So it's a very famous mastering EQ. And I like this a lot, like the way this curve behaves. It just lets me add gentle top end in a way that sounds very transparent, very musical. It's just something that is very useful, especially in mastering settings. And the other end of the spectrum, I've just adjusted to give me a low shelf instead of a low cut. And you can customize all of this as your starting point presets. You don't have to mess too much with this. I just find this a bit more versatile than the FabFilter Pro Q3. If you already have the FabFilter, that's probably not a reason to switch to this. But if you are considering getting something like the FabFilter, then you might also want to look at this option. We are here on the drum tops group. It actually already sounds quite good. I might want to get a little bit more upper mids presence and impact here, but for this, I will actually show you a different plugin, the second one on my list. I'm a huge fan of SSL Channel Strip plugins. Now, what exact brand should you go for? It actually doesn't matter that much. I've experienced different ones. I happen to like the one from Plugin Alliance. So there's the 9000 and the 4000 version. The 4000 is like a bit more gritty, I would say. The 9000 is a bit more transparent. I use those both. I don't use the 4000G as much. I like the E series a bit more for most electronic music. And this here is the 9000 version. Now with all the Plugin Alliance plugins, what I do is I put this V gain down as much as possible and the total harmonic distortion as well. This just means that I don't like any analog hiss in my plugins. I want to be able to adjust this to taste. So I don't want this to be there from the beginning. What I like a lot about these types of channel strips is, first of all, they are relatively straightforward. It looks a bit confusing right now. I will not walk you through everything, but just the simplicity of having 4 different EQ bands here that are easy to adjust, and 2 filters, and then a really nice compressor. And actually the compressor is the main reason why I like these plugins. Let's start with the EQ first. So if I wanted, for example, in this drum tops group to have a little bit more upper mids presence, I adjust the Q shape a little bit. Something like 3 kilohertz, around that area. So this is just a bit extreme to show you what this is capable of. You can already hear like a little bit of the crunch of the console coming in because it's already hitting a bit too hard. This is just something that I like a lot for percussions. I also like it a lot on kick drums. And no, I will still not meticulously gain stage everything in this video. It's not the point here. Just want to show you what I'm currently using. For kick drums, it's really nice to use this compressor of either the 4000E or the 9000. Let's just use the 4000 now. For whatever reason, if you use an SSL compressor, there is something to this that's like a special snappiness. If you don't use the super fast attack settings, I like the standard setting that it is on the default mode quite a lot. So this is way too extreme, of course. When I use this on kick drums, I mainly just touch it a little bit, so 3 dB of gain reduction. The ratio typically is somewhere between 2 and 4. Actually don't want the filters engaged. And then you can really easily shape it with, for example, here the low end EQ, a bit more oomph here. I find the top end a bit too aggressive on this kick drum, so I can either reduce it with a shelf, or I can use a low pass filter. What I like a lot about these channel strips is they give me an immediate result that just sounds about right. I don't need to mess with it too much. You have to get used to this workflow a little bit. It's very different from working compared to a equalizer like the Kirchhoff or the Fab filter. But once you have your channel strips that you like, it's actually a lot of fun to use. And yeah, sometimes they give you something special. Now, in some cases, you don't want this SSL channel strip characteristic. You want something a bit smoother, something that is like a bit more airy, a bit more sweet. And in this case, I go for something that comes from the Teac style of EQs, and there's actually one channel strip that I like a lot in this regard. So this is the Teac channel strip. I've slapped it on the bass right now. As you can see, you have an equalizer here. This is like the classic Teac equalizer. Then you have the mid Teac equalizer down here, and then this is the CL1B style compressor. This is a very, very interesting compressor that is, I would say, mostly for smoother vocals. A lot of rappers are actually using this as well. I like it a lot on bass sounds. I like it also on lead sounds from time to time. Now let's work with this a little bit on bass. Let's start with the top section here. The low end is here, the top end is here, and you actually have to read the manual and understand how this thing works. You can't just throw it on and try to use it because you don't know how these knobs are connected. Let's listen to the bass. Actually sounds quite nice. I would like to give it like a slight boost around the 60 Hertz region, which is quite low, but I want the kick drum to poke through a little bit above that in the 100 to 120 area. And so I want to have like a really deep, smooth low end below that. As you can see, the signal is already running quite hot, but there's something that I like in this case, because here, this is coming from a very special EQ design. So if you push it a little bit harder, run more signal into it, then obviously it sounds different compared to if you just send a little bit of signal to it. And so it does something that I like quite a lot in terms of saturation. Now, if you wanted to go into more of a hard groove style with this track or with this mix, what you can do is you can roll off the top end of the bass almost completely. So you can do this as well here by selecting the attenuation frequency, which would be 5 kHz here, and then using this knob in combination with it. So it's really nice for creating these fat basses that have a lot of harmonic saturation. With the mid section, we could, for example, boost the lower mids a little bit more. But I think it would get overwhelming if you do more than that. This is the compressor section of this EQ. I personally find that in most cases it's a bit too extreme. So I use it in parallel, so using the wet dry knob here. That is the use case in 90% of cases that I use for this. So already, like, the standard setting is super extreme. So let's just go for 2:1, maybe a little bit more. Bit slower attack time, bit faster release time, so that the bass lives a little bit more. This is really nice. Now it reacts to the peaks of the bass. It softens them a little bit, but it's not too extreme. So sometimes if you have a bass that plays a lot of notes like this one, it's a good way to control the signal while also adding some character to this. This is what I like this compressor for. This is 100% wet now. Let's just feed a bit of the dry signal back in. Much more controlled now, the signal. Obviously I could make up for this a little bit, so it's a bit quieter than the original. Let's listen to it in context. I get some comments that people just don't hear the differences from time to time. This is because you have to train your ears to this. As a mixing and mastering engineer, you make a lot of small tweaks on many different channels that add up to something that is just sounding better overall without tweaking stuff in a strange way. This is just how I work, how most mixing mastering engineers work, and I will just not lie about this. I will not make super extreme tweaks just to prove that something's happening here. The next plugin on my list is an all-time favorite of mine. It's a secret weapon that I use in almost every mix, and the best part is that it's super easy to use. Now before we get there, you might struggle with finishing songs and not only the mixing part. And if that's the case, I have something for you. It's called the Finisher Framework. My 3 simple steps that you can use to finish at least one great sounding song per month. You can get it at pickyourself.com/framework. It's super easy to read, just takes you 3 to 5 minutes. If you implement those steps, I promise that you will finish much more music than you currently do. Go to pickyourself.com/framework and I will see you on the other side. Listen to this drum loop here. There's this head sound in the background and I want it to be much more present in the mix. So what do? Do I try to bring it up with EQ? Do I try to compress it in a certain way that the transient is enhanced? No, there is a better solution and it's called the Transient Designer. It's such a fantastic tool. This tool is so easy to use yet so effective. It's kind of a compressor and you can just increase the amount of attack that you perceive and the amount of sustain. So you can decrease this, increase this if you want it to be more snappy, or the other way around. So let's say I want this to be more washed out overall. I could just bring the attack down. This is an extreme setting, but this is how you can, for example, get more tail sounds or room sounds out of something. I would like to use it in the opposite way. I will just increase the attack. Now you notice that it becomes much more snappy. I'll just A/B it. And if you add this subtly to different percussion sounds in your mix, the whole mix starts to snap, it starts to come to life, and everything just sounds much more snappy. I really, really like this. Very subtle effect, but I just love this tool. Next up, here's one of my favorite reverbs. And by the way, I've made a complete reverb tutorial, like going through all the settings that you will ever come across in reverbs and how they actually interact with the sound. It's a super in-depth tutorial. You can watch it here. This Softtube TSAR is one of my go-to reverbs, especially for smaller rooms. It's an algorithmic reverb. And by the way, in this other video, I also talk about the difference between convolution and algorithmic reverbs. What I like this for is, for example, here on this drum tops group, let me just bring this down a bit. So this is 7% wet now. Already you can hear a lot of the reverb effect, even though there's just a tiny amount of this fed into it. Right now the room is still relatively large sounding because the time is almost 2 seconds. I will bring this down a bit. Let me just make this 50-50 so you actually hear more of the reverb. So this was the setting before. Make it much smaller. And then this is the important bit here. I love the early reflections in this specific reverb. So I bring it up. So early reflections are the direct reflections of the sound, like the walls next to you, for example. And the reverb here, this is kind of the tail when a sound bounces from one wall to the next, to this, to there. And then like at the end of the reverb, this is this tail. But I really love this early reflections program. I can increase the density of the reverb. And then decrease the wet signal to bring it down. Right now you barely hear the reverb. I will just make it a bit more extreme. But this is what I love about this. You can be super subtle and create a sense of space around objects in your mix, especially percussion sounds, because you still want them to cut through, but at the same time you want your mix to sound three-dimensional and really impactful. And this little tool here helps quite a bit with that. Fantastic reverb. Now, if I want the opposite of that, if I want something to sound super lush, super deep, super immersive, for example, on lead sounds, then I go for Superplate. This is such a nice plugin. So we're now hearing 100% wet, which is bring us down. It gives you so many different plates. I'll just walk you through some of the sounds. Some of them sound a bit more present, for example this one. And you can choose between different inputs here, so something's going through tubes or through specific transistors. It doesn't really matter which one does what, because you just listen to it and find out what exactly sounds best. And it becomes more obvious once you push it more. So you can adjust the pre-delay. So I actually like some pre-delay on some of these lusher reverbs, because then you can separate the original dry sound a bit from the reverb that happens afterwards. But I also quite like a combination of reverbs and delays. Now I like the Ableton Echo quite a lot, but sometimes what gives me nice results is the replica. So this is a bonus. This wasn't on my list, but it's a bonus. Like I really love the replica delay by Native Instruments. It's a dotted 8th setting. And now I'm feeding the replica into the Superplate. In most cases, I actually use a return track and run both of them into the return track. Here, I'm just using a bit of wet-dry processing. The cool thing about the replica is that here you can add things like frequency shifter, pitch shifting, all of these cool things. Actually sounds quite nice. This is more sound design than actual mixing. But I love both of these tools for specific reasons. And yeah, if you have just one really good algorithmic reverb like the TSAR from Softube, and then in combination with a plate reverb like the Superplate, everything's covered. In Ableton Live, I love the hybrid reverb. There are so many options in there, so you probably don't even need those extra options. As a professional mixing and mastering engineer, I sometimes want the best tools out there for a specific use case. And then there's also something to be said. I have worked with the TSAR for many years. I know this reverb so intimately that I can create exactly the space that I want. It just has to do with experience, obviously, that you gain. This is the reason why still some of the best mixing and mastering engineers in the world that cost like $5,000, $10,000, $15,000 per mix, they still use some of the Waves plugins from like the early 2000s, because they're just used to those tools and they know exactly what they do. One of my favorite pro audio brands for plugins is actually TDR, Tokyo Dawn Records. They have this fantastic Infrasonic filter. I'm using this on the master bus right now. And the cool thing about the Infrasonic plugin is that it just lets you just focus on the very low frequencies here. So you see the spectrum starts at 200 Hertz and goes down to below 5 Hertz. So here's the 0 line. In most cases, you don't need stuff below 20 Hertz. But then on the other hand, sometimes you also don't want the phase shift that's being introduced by a low-cut filter. This is not something that I do on all channels, not at all. It's also not even something that I do on every master. I just let my ear decide if I want a low cut or not. Typically, if you have like a slope that is more relaxed like this one, you don't get that much phase shift in your material, so it's not something that is something you need to worry about. What I love about this plugin is that not only does it show you pretty nicely what's going on down here. So this is the curve after the EQ. The upper curve is the curve before the filter. You can adjust the slope. You can adjust the frequency, of course. You can even mix this in. The cool thing about this, my favorite setting, is this dynamic bump here. This dynamic bump actually brings back a little bit of the low-end energy that you sometimes lose by cutting this. It's very weird. Sometimes it sounds fantastic, sometimes it doesn't work at all, but I love that they included this setting. Sometimes with groovy low end like here, it just sounds really nice. So this tool is a really nice helper, I love it. Once you become more experienced in mixing and mastering, you understand more about working with buses, so like main groups and stems of instruments. And one tool that stands out for me still to this day is the Shadow Hills mastering compressor. So there are two different versions. I actually like the Class A version a bit more sonically. Shadow Hills is one of those like super mysterious boutique brands of analog gear, but I think Plugin Alliance did a great job modeling this piece. So I've heard the original piece in the mastering studio that one of my mentors was running, and so I know this original hardware unit. I haven't done any A/B shootout, of course, because back then this plugin didn't exist, but it reminds me quite a lot of the sound that I was experiencing in that studio. Right now I have it on the master bus sitting. Just actually have to pull it before the limiter, of course. So it's sitting after the infrasonic, but before the limiter right now. I typically link the parameters between those two channels, of course. I would try to hit the two different compression stages that this compressor has. They're shown here in those different meters. Just a tiny bit on master bus, so not even 1 dB of gain reduction, like a little bit slower. So I'll bring the ratio down, so 1.2 to 1. The attack time, I leave it quite long so that the transients can come through. I just want to gently compress the signal overall, glue it together a little bit. It's basically what the Ableton Glue compressor is also really good for. I like to activate the sidechain filter on this EQ. I actually did a video about this style of compression with the TDR called Kof compressor in this video here. But right here you can do something similar. So I will sidechain this, bring the filter to, let's say like around 200 Hertz. So we leave most of the low end intact. Like the first optical stage. Optical is just a style of compressor. This is being hit just a tiny bit. And then you can feed it into the second stage, which is a discrete compressor. This was the ratio of the discrete, because the optical, of course, it reacts depending on the signal that comes in. So you can really dial this in. But with the discrete one, you can dial these stages in very precisely. So here I have the 1.2 to 1 ratio, slow attack time. And recover is basically the release time. Very nice. And here you have different transformer settings, nickel, iron, steel. These are just different saturation curves, but it's super subtle. If you push this thing in a very extreme way, then you hear them more, but actually in most cases, you will not hear that much of a difference between those three settings. In mastering, it makes a difference. For most mixing sessions, actually, it does not make that much of a difference. So in this case, the difference is almost not audible. That was the Shadow Hill mastering compressor. Now let's move on to the last plugins on my list. And the next one is our good old friend, the FabFilter Pro L2. It's still, to me, the best limiter out there right now. I also like the Ozone Maximizer quite a bit. It's much better than the typical, Ableton standard limiter. I think they should really update this thing. It just doesn't work on a master bus. That's the problem with it. I mainly use the modern setting or the aggressive setting or the transparent setting. Those are the three algorithms that I personally find sound the best. What I love about this limiter is that you can actually dial in the attack time. This is like the attack time until the release stage hits. You can decide how to link the channels, so the transients and the release time, you can link or unlink them. There's a few weird videos out there that to master super loud, you have to bring this up completely, bring these down completely, and it's always going to give you the loudest master. That is total BS. It will just distort like crazy on some material and work super well on other material. So this is something where you really need to listen to the music and see what type of settings actually work. Most of the time I start with around like 1000 milliseconds and pretty quick release time, 7 milliseconds, around that mark. Oversampling is also quite important. This helps you get rid of some intersample peaks. There's also a true peak limiting function. Sometimes it doesn't sound as good as just using more oversampling. Can't tell exactly why that is. There's like a lot of theories around this. But to me, the oversampling typically sounds better than the true peak limiting. Now, in a mastering session, I don't even do mastering in Ableton. I do it in Wavelab. There I run every session on 96 kilohertz anyway. So everything is already oversampled. Still, I typically use between 2 times and 4 times oversampling. 2 times should be the minimum to just detect most of the intersample peaks. You can activate this 1-to-1 setting, which just means when I feed more signal into the limiter, it's automatically compensating for this on the output. It lets me make a fair comparison. Does it actually sound good, or when does the sound collapse? So here, this is when it starts to sound weird. This is like a delta signal, a monitoring path where you can listen to what is actually being taken away from the limiter. That's quite nice. You can go to like -8. Like, this is not even a real mix here. It's relatively transparent. The crackles, like, I mean, they sound extreme right now in solo, but honestly, in music, you basically don't hear it. So FabFilter Pro L2, fantastic limiter. It still stands the test of time. It's one of my absolute favorites. Now, the last plugin on my list is absolutely essential in my opinion. It's Metric AB. It's a very nice AB tool to just compare your music to reference tracks. Now, you can create workarounds in Ableton where you can AB between different tracks, but I just find this so much more convenient. You just slap it on your master bus. So you can load in a reference track. You can also, for example, use the last version of your mix if you want to compare your current mix to the version that you did before. You can load in the old version and then compare A to B. It's really nice is that it shows you all the different spectrum analysis, stereo image, loudness. And what I personally like a lot is to activate the dual mode. So you can always see, for example, how does your loudness compare to the other one that you see from the reference track. And you can obviously compensate for that difference in loudness also. So you can just gain match here. Now, obviously, this is 60 dB quieter now because we still have this like 1-to-1 activated here. If I deactivate this, now my editor for the video has to compensate for that as well. Just put this back to 0. A little bit louder, for example, we're at -8.7 integrated LUFS. The other track is at -9.4 right now. But yeah, I like this comparison quite a lot. It's a very nice tool, and what I love about this is that you can load in different reference tracks. So what I typically do is I have the references from my client in here, and then I also have a list of personal references where I know, okay, these are some tracks that sound specifically loud or specifically bass heavy or specifically bright. And that means I can challenge my current mix against those boundaries of the different genres. And that helps me make the right decision. So overall, where do I want this material to sit? I've made a very detailed video on reference tracks and how to use this specific tool and also some other analyzers. You can watch it over here. And yeah, that is it. Let me know in the comments what you think about this. Are there any tools that you want to share with me? Is there anything you would like to hear about my workflow? Leave a comment below and I will see you in the next video.